Hello, fellow fantasy fanatics and romantasy readers alike. We've made it to the point of dread and anticipation, our final episode of A Court of Wings and Ruin. We've made it through impossible odds, emotional damage, questionable decisions, and enough dramatic entrances to keep the Night Court busy for a lifetime. When we left off, Amren had everyone holding their breath with a plan that was a little bit concerning. So let's jump in, but not into the cauldron, and figure out what Amren's plan really is as we dive into the final chapters of A Court of Wings and Ruin. Grab your tea, your tissues, and maybe a therapy bill, because we definitely have an ending to unpack. Let's get into it.
Woo! That was perfect. Okay, we are jumping into chapter 74 through the end. Quite a bit to discuss in this set of chapters. Obviously, I cried because I've cried multiple times throughout all of these books. And I always cry at this part because Rhysand. We just love Rhysand. Okay, so we ended the last episode with a large final battle against Hybern. Hybern has positioned themselves on essentially like a cliff above a valley. And on the other side of that valley is the coast and the ocean. So we have Hybern's army on one side, the Fey army of Prythian in the middle, and then Hybern's second army fighting on the ocean against a human army brought over by Queen Vasa, as well as the Archeron father. Lucian did meet up with them, as well as Miriam and Draken and their flying Seraphim. So all of them have come over from the east. They've all come over from the east and are fighting against the Hybern army on the sea. We did have the other two High Lords, Tamlin of the Spring Court and Baron of the Autumn Courts, come in with their armies. And they were also joined by Jurian, who was helping to lead a small human army with Grayson from the bottom of the Prythian Island, that small section of the human realm. So we have pretty much everybody on Prythian, Hybern in multiple forms, and some additional allies from other areas that have now clashed in this large battle. Feyre, Amren have made it across the battlefield to the cauldron. Nesda and Cassian went in the opposite direction to try and lure the King of Hybern away by having Nesda call up her powers so that he was drawn to her powers. And we have completely ended last episode with Amren telling Feyre that she is sorry. We start this episode with her saying, "I'm sorry, I lied." But we ended with Feyre realizing that Amren has lied to her about this new spell and what it is actually going to do. So it isn't a spell to nullify the cauldron or to nullify the King of Hybern and his armies. It is actually a spell that is going to unbind Amren from her current form. But before we get to all of that, Feyre has now put her hand on the cauldron, just like she did at the end of book 2. And she is unable to remove her hand. She is struggling again with the amount of power that it is taking to hold on to the cauldron and keep herself in herself. She gets to a point where she cannot remove her hand, could not pry her fingers away. I was being shredded apart slowly and thoroughly. And she mentions feeling the cauldron touch her. And then she is half there and half flying across the battlefield with the cauldron. So what ends up happening is the cauldron is also being called to Nesda and her rallying that power, because the cauldron still sees Nesda as a thief who stole extra power from it. Kind of half of Feyre's consciousness is flying across the battlefield with the cauldron. Feyre does get a chance to kind of inspect the battlefield, and they are losing very badly. So they need Feyre to do something, and real fast, because it's going downhill. That she does get to see Rhysand actually shift into his animalistic form, his High Lord being form, whichever you want to call it. This is not a form that he takes very often. In fact, it's not a form that she's ever seen him in. We have seen Tamlin in his beast form multiple times because he can't hold his anger back and immediately shifts because of that, whereas Rhysand is a lot better at holding his anger in check, therefore he does not change very often. But Feyre does mention she gets to see him shift as she's being hurled across the battlefield with the cauldron, and that the form he takes is exactly the form that she saw on the throne in the Court of Nightmares. It is the same kind of scaly winged beast. After Rhys shifts, Helion also shifts into what Feyre calls the daytime equivalent. He's golden feathers, shredded claws, feathered wings, whereas Rhys is black. He is a thing of nightmares, is how Feyre describes him. And then she is continuing to shoot across the field and isn't able to see as Rhys and Helion both come up against a Hybern commander. Helion wants to take on the commander on his own, so Rhys goes back to fighting all the normal people. And then Feyre and the cauldron are brought to the scene where Nesda and Cassian are. That they're talking about the King of Hybern was going to be there soon. They could feel his power coming. And that Nesda had rallied her power and was holding on to it. And Feyre realizes that Nesda's plan is to let it go as soon as he gets there and have essentially the killing blow on the king. That she'd kill him as soon as he was there. But then we realize why the King of Hybern had gazed towards the east, towards the sea, before winnowing away. Feyre and Amren saw that before they made it to the cauldron. We find out it is because the King of Hybern has gone to the Nesda ship, picked up their father, and brought him as a human shield to this clearing where Nesda and Cassian are. So because of that, Nesda's power just winks out because she is not going to kill her father. She's not even going to risk trying to kill the king and avoid hurting her father. It just completely winks out, which is exactly what the king thought was going to happen. That's why he brought him. But we do have a very short, very loving interaction between Nesda and her father. Nesda doesn't really get to say a whole lot, but the father is able to say, I loved you from the first moment I held you in my arms. I am so sorry, Nesda. My Nesda. I am so sorry for all of it. All Nesda says is to the King of Hybern, please. She is begging him not to hurt her father. He says, what will you give me? Will you give back what you took? And she says, yes. And he asks, even if I have to carve it out of you. And before she can respond, their father says, don't you lay your filthy hands on my daughter. And then the King of Hybern breaks his neck. So he is now dead. There is no way to revive him. Feyre is watching this entire scene. She says, I heard the crack before I realized what happened. And just as the king had predicted, Nesda's power officially flickered out as she looks at their father crumbled on the ground with his neck snapped. So Cassian, now that there's no longer a human shield in front of the king, he unleashes himself with his sword. He knows he's not going to be able to kill the king, but enough to at least push the king away from their father's body, long enough to kind of hold him off. And Feyre says, only long enough to hold him off for perhaps Nesda to run, or for me to finish what I had let my family give their lives for. So at this point, her dad has died, and she and all of her other two sisters have now become Fae, all in an attempt to save and fix Prythian. Feyre is watching Nesda just stare at their father's dead body, and then she can see the power that starts to rise back in Nesda's body. Cassian is still battling with the king just farther into the trees outside of their little clearing, but he is being essentially torn apart from the inside. The king is using both his sword skills as well as his magic to start breaking the bones in Cassian's body to the point where his wings are snapped in spots. There's blood leaking out of them. A bone is jutting out of his thigh. His siphons are dull because they've already been drained. Blood is rushing out of his nose. And he's on the ground having a hard time rising because of the amount of pain that he is in. And the King of Hybern is using his power to continue to break the bones in his body. So Nessa finally comes over and tells him to stop, and then says, I'm going to kill you. And the king's response is, really? Because I can think of far more interesting things to do with you. And she doesn't say anything else, just lets it rip her power. But I love that Feyre mentions the cauldron crept along with Nesda, a hound at her side. And then Nezda lets out the power, all of that power all at once, and the king winnows out of the way. Her power blasted the trees behind him to cinders, blasted across the battlefield in a low arc, then landed right in the Hybern ranks, taking out hundreds before they knew what had happened. So very similar to what happened when Rhys and Azrael and everybody else had sent out their initial shots at the beginning of this battle. And she uses the majority of her power to do this because she thought it was going to get the king. Of course, he knew this was going to happen. He knew she'd try and do it, so he winnowed out of the way. So they realized that Nezda is out of power. Cassian is trying to crawl to her again, just like he did in book 2 when she was getting pushed into the cauldron. He is trying to tell Nezda to run, but she is not interested. So she does pick up Cassian's blade, but she has 0 skills. She's done no training in any regard. So the king is able to remove the blade from her hands very quickly. But Nezda's goal is just to get the king away from Cassian, to draw him back towards the clearing a little bit. He does strike her across the face hard enough that she goes down. Cassian cries out her name, trying again to crawl to her. And then she is able to let out a white burning power shot out of her palm that slammed into his chest. So she tried to pull him away from Cassian, then hits him with her power, and her power actually pushes him back through multiple trees, and she rushes back over to Cassian, trying to get him up to help him so that they can run, but he is not able to stand, and the King of Hybern is coming back. Cassian's trying to tell Nezda to go, and her response is, "I can't." Cassian turns to her and says, "I have no regrets in my life but this, that we did not have time, that I did not have time with you." So Nezda does lay her body over Cassian's because she knows neither one of them is going to be able to get away. Feyre is trying to offer the cauldron a bargain. She's trying to do anything to get the king to stop from killing Nezda and Cassian. She is offering it anything it could possibly want, but the cauldron isn't interested. It's not a sentient thing, so it isn't interested in making a bargain with her. And then the king raises his hand, and I think it's interesting that Feyre mentions his power is whirling like a dark galaxy in his palm, because we really haven't seen the king's power other than dark power is all it's described as, but we do have a dark galaxy in his palm is what it looks like. But before he can shoot it towards Cassian and Nezda, a black blade broke through the king's throat, spraying blood. And then Elaine steps out of a shadow from behind him. So she literally steps out of a shadow from behind the king. So it makes you wonder if this is just truth teller that allowed her to kind of walk through the shadows, because we learned at like some point in the last episode, the last couple of chapters, that Rhys took Elaine to the opposite side of their camp, the farthest place away from the battle. So how did Elaine, she didn't walk probably to this spot. So how did she get there? And it makes it sound kind of like she walked through shadows. Elaine steps out of a shadow behind the King of Hybern and rams Truth Teller to the hilt through the back of the king's neck as she snarled in his ear, "Don't you touch my sister." So Elaine with a little bit more backbone. We've talked about it a little bit, that she's coming out of her shell. We see little bits and pieces of her officially. She's doing something awesome. And Feyre mentioned that the cauldron purred in her presence, because we know that the cauldron gave more to Elaine because of how beautiful she was, and the cauldron chose to do that. Whereas the cauldron didn't choose to give it to Nezda, but Nezda took it instead. So Elaine moves away from the king and the knife sticking out of his throat, blood spurting everywhere. And then Nezda comes up, grabs Truth Teller's obsidian hilt, and then twists the blade like around his neck to officially cut off his head in a very descriptive and brutal manner. She does sever flesh and bone and tendon, and the king's head then falls off. At that point, Feyre mentions that the cauldron realizes that Elaine has defended the thief, as in Nezda. The Elaine who it had gifted such powers found her so lovely that it had wanted to give her something. It would not harm Elaine, even if it meant not going to collect the bit that had been taken from it. So Neza is officially safe from the cauldron because Elaine has stood up for her. So as Feyre's being pulled back across the battlefield to where the actual cauldron and Feyre's body are, she is looking back over the battlefield one last time, realizing that it's gotten worse in the last couple of seconds, couple of minutes. Rhys and the other High Lords have given themselves wholly over to the monsters that lurked beneath their skins. The Hybern commander who is fighting against Helion is not injured whatsoever, whereas Helion is struggling. So we can assume that battle is going to go very poorly for Helion pretty soon. Bryaxis was still fighting, still holding the line with Grayson's army. A black cloud that cut a path for them, shielded them, fear itself guarding the mortals. But Hybern is still overwhelming them. Without the king, without the cauldron, they'd still do it because the king had roused such fervor in his people and their belief that they had been wronged and forgotten. They would keep fighting, even without the king, even without the cauldron. No solution would ever appease them beyond the complete reclaiming of what they still believed they were entitled to, which is all of Prythian, the other continent, all of it. They believe it belongs to them, and that humans should be their slaves again. Rhys then starts roaring in pain. Feyre realizes that he is struggling now too, but she has no control over what is happening, and the cauldron does pull them back to where it is located up on the cliff. Then Feyre kind of comes back into her body, and Amren is slapping her in the face, shouting her name, telling her to fight it, to fight the cauldron's power. But Feyre is just thinking Rhys is hurt, that he's being overwhelmed, and then she snaps back into her body officially, and there is now a living bond between her and the cauldron, and the cauldron kind of settles and doesn't overwhelm Feyre anymore. But she does tell Amren that the king is dead, goes to tell her you're going to be soon too, and Amren says, well, I know, but I need you to help me do this first. So Amren tells her that she needs Feyre to be a conduit for between the cauldron and Amren to unbind her current form. That the Suriel had given Feyre a message to give to Amren that was only for Amren, only for the type of person that she is, because she is bound in her current Fey body. Amren says, I thought I'd need your sisters to help you control the cauldron, but after you faced the Ouroboros, I knew you could do it just you and just me, because when you unbind me with the cauldron's power in my real form, I will wipe that army away, every last one of them. And then a male voice pleads from behind her, don't. And Varian appears. Amren smirks and teases like a hound on a scent, but he is there to try and talk her out of it because he cares about her already. And Feyre says, I thought you told us that you wouldn't remember us, that you won't remember anything once you're freed. And Amren says, I watched them for so many eons, humans in my world. There were humans too, and I watched them love and hate, wage senseless wars, and find precious peace, watch them build lives, build worlds. I was never... Okay, pause for a second, because she literally just said, I've watched them build worlds. So she's high enough on the food chain to not officially be a part of a world, but more like a galaxy to watch humans build worlds, which is interesting. We don't get a ton of information on what Amren was before, but we get little bits and pieces. I was never allowed such things. I had not been designed that way, had not been ordered to do so. So I watched, and that day I came here, it was the first selfish thing I had done. For a long, long while, I thought it was punishment for disobeying my father's orders, for wanting. I thought this world was some hell he'd locked me into for disobedience. But I wonder if my father knew, if he saw how I watched them love and hate and build, and opened that rip in the world not as a punishment but as a gift. For it has been a gift, this time with all of you. At this point, Varian is trying to beg her again not to do it, but Amren says, tell the High Lord, tell Rhys, to leave out a cup for me. And then she turns to Varian and says, I watched them most, the humans who loved. I never understood it, how it happened, why it happened. I think I might have learned with you, though. Perhaps that was the last gift, too. Poor Varian. Then Amren tells Feyre, when I am free, don't run. It will attract my attention, and then I'll kill you. So Amren then grabs Feyre's wrist, the arm that's not on the cauldron, and swings herself into the cauldron. Okay. For Amren is in the cauldron. Half of Feyre's arm is also in the cauldron under the dark water that had all of a sudden filled it up, and that it's difficult for her to actually get her tongue to say the words for the spell, but that she has to do it with her mouth as well as with her heart and her blood and her bones, and combine it all to be able to really enunciate the spell. And then when the spell ended, shuddering out of me, and I snapped back. She loses the hold on the cauldron, falls back, but Varian catches her, and then they wait for just a second, and then Feyre mentioned they could feel it start far, far below, beneath us, as if she had gone to the Earth's core. And Varian kind of pulls her back a few steps, and they manage to hide behind a rock before Amren essentially comes up and erupts from the cauldron. The cauldron shattered into 3 pieces, peeling apart like a blossoming flower, and then she came. She exploded from that mortal shell, light blinding us, light and fire. And she was roaring in victory and rage and pain. And Feyre says, and I could have sworn I saw great burning wings, each feather a simmering ember, spread wide, could have sworn a crown of incandescent light floated just above her flaming hair. Then she paused, looks at them almost to say, I remember you. And then she spread those wings, flame and light rippling to encompass her, no more than a burning behemoth that swept down upon Hybern's armies, and they began running. Amren comes down, raining fire and brimstone, which I think is cool because Feyre talks about her eyes looking like Quicksilver, and now she is raining down brimstone. I don't know what the connection from Quicksilver to brimstone is, but that's what the book names are called, so I feel like there has to be.
I mean, there should be somewhere.
Right? I don't know. I haven't read those books yet. Okay, so then Amren essentially sweeps across the Hybern army. Some died at the mere whisper of her passing. Others, she just destroys herself. It's raining fire and brimstone. Some die that way as well. And then bit by bit, she destroys all of Hybern's army. And as she's getting through the entire army, she is slowly starting to fade. She does make it to all of the Hybern ships as well and is able to kill and destroy all of the Hybern ships, as if she had inhaled the life right out of them, even while her own life sputtered out. Amren reached the final boat, the very last ship of our enemy, and was no more than a flame on the breeze. And then when that ship fell silent, there was only light, bright, clean light dancing on the waves. And she is gone. For now.
I love that as she's gone, we talk about her being dark. There's so many allusions to her darkness throughout. I love that it's finished off with everything being light. Like she absorbs the darkness.
Yes.
The imagery there was just so perfect.
Right? She's absorbing the darkness of Hybern and cleansing it.
It's it's crazy.
Sorry.
No, that's what I was going to ask. Isn't there a Throne of Glass reference with that one? Where she has some sort of cleansing flame. Oh, I was thinking there was a cleansing flame. Okay.
Yes, when she removes the Vogue, her flame cleanses. But I think Kay was mentioning the biblical reference.
The brimstone, the fire and the brimstone. That's
yeah.
But just further her being Mitchell, maybe.
Yes, exactly. Because we get that she wasn't made to do the same things that the humans do, that she didn't obey her father, and father is a capital F.
And that she watched the world.
Yes, and she watched the world, watched the humans. And then when we see her form or glimpse her form, it is a fiery winged being with presumably a halo above her head. So very similar to our reference when we talked about her cleansing Valaris, looking for the Hybern, any Hybern people there, much in a Holy Spirit kind of way. Okay, yeah, Varian and Feyre kind of get up at that point and they're looking around like what is happening, and realize that something is going on with the cauldron because Amren did tear it apart into 3 pieces when she erupted from it. That the thing in the cauldron, or lack of it, was a lack of substance, absence, and presence, and it was leaking into the world. It was a void, but also not a void. What does that remind you of? It was a whole, airless, no life could exist here, no light. Sounds like a black hole to me. Foreshadowing! Okay. Rhys then pops up because now Amren has destroyed the entire Highburn army. So Rhys joins them. Feyre lets him into her mind so that he can see everything that she saw in the last couple of minutes, what happened. And now they're kind of looking over their shoulder to this thing that's lurking behind them, which is a void coming out of the pieces of the cauldron, kind of in the cauldron's place. To where that fissure in the world within the shards of the cauldron, it was growing because our very world was bound to it. So if the cauldron was destroyed, then they were going to be destroyed as well. So I think it's pretty funny. She picks up the Book of Breathing, trying to look through it for a spell to help. And it's all in symbols that she doesn't know because Amren was the only one who knew the language of the book. So she gets frustrated and just hurls it into the void. And of course it disappears. But now it's hurled into a void of nothing. So, maybe it'll show up later. We'll see. It vanished and did not appear again. And Rhys says, well, that's one way to try. But then he says, Amren said you were a conduit, so be one again. Remake the cauldron, forge it anew with his power. And Feyre realizes she thinks through the spell that Amren had told her that she had used to unbind Amren. And if she changes one word, one small thing, she could potentially use the same spell or the bones of that spell to actually bind instead of unbind. And I love that she says, perhaps in this we would be lucky too. Because Rhys mentioned a couple chapters ago that he didn't want their luck to run out while Feyre's life was on the line. Now it's about to run out, and it's not her life on the line. So she grabs his hand to be that conduit from his power to the cauldron to try and rebind it. Notices his shields are up. Doesn't really think anything of it. Doesn't realize until afterwards that there is a reason he has actually kept his shields up. She remembers the mural that she had seen in the study in the spring court of the way the story of Prythian, how it was made by the slender female hands that poured the cauldron out where all life had flowed from. And so she uses her female hands to kind of cup the cauldron as if she could cup their whole world, hold their entire world in her palm. I would need to forge, to weld, to bind. And she is able to kind of get the cracks to move together. And that's where she can see where the fissures are that she'll need to rebind. And so she mentions that the first one she was able to get, and then the second one worked as well. And then she needs just a little bit more power, and Rhys, of course, gives it to her. Rhys handed over everything. She can hear him whispering, I love you to her multiple times throughout this whole scene. The power shuddering from him through her. And she says, the second crack healed. I felt him tremble behind me, heard his wet rasp of breath. I tried to turn around, but again he whispers, I love you. And the third and final crack began to heal over, and his power begins to sputter, but it kept flowing out. So Feyre throws a little bit of hers in as well, as much as she has, without burning herself out. Says we gave every last drop until the cauldron was whole, until the thing it contained, it was in there locked away. And no, there are no cracks, completely whole. And then she finally realizes that Rhys is no longer right behind her, so she turns around and he is sprawled on the ground, wings draped behind him, looking like he was sleeping. And then she realized that it wasn't there. That thing that rose and fell with each breath, that echoed each heartbeat, the mating bond. It wasn't there. It was gone because his own chest was not moving. Rhys is dead. Which is super sad. And she mentions the emptiness in her chest, in her soul, at the lack of that bond, that life. Like, it's almost like her life has left her because Rhys has left. Others come in, Cassian, Moore, Azriel, and then slowly the High Lords start trickling in as well. She can hear them saying things around her, but all I could hear was that last I love you, which had not been a declaration, but a goodbye, because he had known he had nothing left and stopping it would take everything. It would cost him everything. And he kept his shields up so I wouldn't see, because I wouldn't have said yes. I would have rather the world ended than this thing he had done and this emptiness where he was where we were, which I think is really interesting because we have a very similar situation with Aelin in the end of Throne of Glass series, where she is forging the lock and it requires all of her power. And the difference is between the two because Aelin goes into it just like Rhys did. She went into it knowing that she had to make that sacrifice and was willing to do it. And her mate, Rowan, didn't like it, but he was okay with it for the greater good. Whereas Rhys, just like Aelin, is willing to give all of himself, but Feyre was not willing to give him. So I think it's just interesting to compare the two couples, that they're very similar and yet very different in certain ways. Thesan comes in trying to figure out if he's able to be healed. He's not. Helion does try and make a little quip and say, of course he did. Of course he gave all of himself and didn't rely on anyone else for this task. Because, really, could you not have waited a couple of minutes for other people to show up so you could have, a chain of people and just use some of everybody's magic? Because it didn't sound like the black hole was leaking out of the cauldron super fast. But no, Rhys just had to go and do it himself, self-sacrificing. But Feyre can feel the torn scraps of the mating bond floating around, floating on a phantom wind inside me. So we get our lovely little phrase again. I grasped at them, tugged at them as if he'd answer, and she just chants stay over and over and over again in her mind, thinking the Suriel had told me to stay with the High Lord, and she doesn't want that to be a lie. And most of the High Lord have walked in and have all around staring at them. She yells at them to bring him back. You did it for me, now you need to do it for him. Helion starts to say, you were human, it's not the same. Feyre says, I don't care, do it. And then she starts to kind of rally her power in an attempt to go into each of their minds and convince them to do this, force them if she had to. She doesn't care about the rules or the laws at this point. She just needed him back. So Tarquin steps forward and does extend his hand and that little kernel of power and says, for what he gave, both today and for many years before. I love that he mentions that because he's one of the few High Lords that actually saw or thought he could see what Rhys was doing with Amarantha. Most of the other High Lords didn't pick up on that, but Tarquin did without even knowing Rhys. So Tarquin gives his little seat of power. Helion, Callias, and Thesan all come up and do the same thing. Baron stands there for a minute because he's not quite sure. Mor pulls out her sword, puts it on his throat, and says, I don't mind killing one more person. And then Baron does step forward and hold out his little bit of power as well. Feyre at that point realizes that she is the High Lady of Night Court, so she is the one who will have to give him the Night Court part of that power. And so she says, I held out my palm, willing that spark of life to appear, but nothing happened. So she just says to no one in particular, tell me how. And it's Thesan who steps forward, explaining that the core of power and on and on and on. We don't get to learn what that is because Feyre doesn't feel it's important. Whatever, Feyre. But she is able to pull out a little bit of her own power, a bit of her life to put on Rhys, and that's when she realized that Tamlin has just stepped into the room and he is the last High Lord that they would need this spark from. So she says Tamlin stood there summoned either by the death of a fellow High Lord or one of the others had summoned him. He was splattered in mud. Whatever, we don't care. He actually did something for once. Craziness. He studies Rhys. Anyway, there was no kindness on his face, no mercy, and so all she says is, please, I will give you anything, those are the exact words, the phrase that Tamlin used when he was trying to get Rhys to break the bargain with Feyre in Book 2. So Tamlin kind of realizes that she truly does love Rhys-Anne, and that it isn't some mind control or power or anything like that this is who she truly loved. So she's kind of murmuring, I will give you anything, over and over again. Finally, he says, be happy, Feyre, and drops that final kernel of light onto Rhys-Anne. Feyre does mention that there is an emotion swimming around in his eyes that she can't place. Most likely it's understanding, but also the realization that their relationship is completely over. She's not coming back. there's nothing he can do. So maybe that is a little bit of understanding to the point where he's going to be over it soon. Fingers crossed. And then Feyre is kind of waiting for his body to come back to life. She mentioned she had witnessed it when it happened to her, obviously. But she says, in the silence, as I waited, I began to tell him of how she fell in love with him. Because he had told her in chapter 54 of book 2 all of why and how he fell in love with her. Now she is reciprocating and doing the same thing. She heard his voice beckoning her to the hills in Calamai, wondered if she had heard him calling for her at that point. And all the laughter, all the goods and bads that they've had of the last couple of months, and all of the life that was still left before them. And then in return, a thud sounded. So his heart finally starts beating again. And he finally wakes up, and Helion says, "You do know how to make an entrance." Or should I say X? And Vivian is like, "You're horrible. That is not something that's funny." And then he sits up and says, "Someone fish dear Amren out of the cauldron before she catches cold." So more Varian and Azriel go running over to the cauldron, and Amren is there, high fae form, no longer has a being lurking beneath her skin. She is completely high fae. And Feyre asks how, and Rhys says she was there when the cauldron was sealing. She was going wherever we go, just like Rhys was. And Rhys says, so I reached out a hand to see if she might want to come back. And Feyre mentions, I knew what she had given up to come back. High fae, and just that. Her silver eyes were solid, unmoving, no smoke, no burning mist within them. And she says, as Amren smiled at me, I wondered if that had been her last gift, was being able to come back. Then Feyre and her sisters do go to burn their father's body. Elaine lays some flowers around him and on him. She mentions that they don't have a prayer to say because in the human realms there are no prayers for the dead, but Feyre has heard one a couple of times now in Prythian, so she does use the milk and honey prayer from book 1, from Under the Mountain. And then as they are leaving, Elaine and Feyre are leaving where they burned her body. Nessa is saying, but it is actually Lucian who comes running up to them. Kind of an awkward interaction. Lucian's fine, Elaine's fine. They're both kind of happy that the other one is fine. I think it's funny that Lucian says, well, I never want to fight in another battle as long as I live, but yes, I'm in one piece. Because if we remember, Lucian wasn't born for the war 500 years ago. That was about the time that Lucian's mom and Helion were having an affair. So it's around that time where he was created. But he was not in that war. So this is the first official war that he's actually fought in. He does, say sorry for your loss in regards to her father, and says, I got one heck of a story to tell you, and don't be surprised if Vasa corners you as soon as the ships are sorted and the sun sets. And Feyre says, so is she really a firebird by day and a human by night? Lucian says, yes, your father, ever the negotiator, managed to cut a deal with Vasa's keeper so that she was able to come here temporarily with her army. But yes, she is a queen by night and a firebird by day. And they mention the human queens are still out there. Lucian's not for long if Vasa has anything to do with it. And he says she's got a foul temper, or even fouler mouth. So, Feyre, the two of you are going to get along just fine, which cracks me up. So at that point, Lucian and Elaine go off in their own direction, and Feyre turns to head back to her tent because she wants to change and bathe and all of that stuff. But when she gets there, realizes that Prince Draken and Miriam are lounging with Rhysand in their tent. And Feyre says to Rhysand, for someone who was just dead, you seem remarkably relaxed. And his response is, I'm so glad you're bouncing back to your usual spirits, Feyre. And Draken snorts and tries to make a joke by saying what he doesn't want to tell you is that he's too old and he can't stand right now. And Feyre doesn't take it as a joke. She thinks he's actually not able to stand. So she starts turning to him in a little bit of a panic. And Rhys is like, no, I'm fine. But he does kind of grumble a little bit because, yes, he was dead. But on top of that, he was probably injured from the battle and he's still overcoming all of that. So Yeah, he's in slightly rough shape. And this is where I think is really interesting because then Miriam and Draken both introduce themselves. Miriam tells her that Reese was just telling them about Farah's story. And Farah thinks in her head, like she knows parts of their story, but she thinks I wanted to know the entire thing. One day, not tomorrow or the day after, but one day I wanted to hear their tale in full. So it makes me wonder if that's like Sarah foreshadowing one of her next books, that we're going to get Miriam and Draken's story, because I would be totally here for that. Okay. Farah does ask if they would be willing to take the cauldron back to Cretea with them, that she wants it out of the reach of the High Lords before anyone can remember that it's there, and it needs to be kind of out of sight, out of mind. They agree to take it, but before they leave, Farah actually wants to have a meeting with everyone, all the major players who are here. She wants to have a meeting with all of them to discuss the peace between them and a new treaty. They end up having this discussion in her family's old estate where they had met with the human queens in book 2. It is mostly ruined because of the King of Hybern, but the sitting room is still there, the giant sitting room that they had used. So it is filled with high lords, princes, generals, commanders, humans, and fae. So a very broad spectrum of people who have joined that for this initial discussion. The High Lords arrive first, starting with Baron, which I think is really interesting that Baron's the first one to show up, because he wasn't the last one to the last High Lord meeting, but he was like the second to last one to arrive. But he's the first one. We get Eris walk in with him, that Eris kind of nods to them in a silent promise that soon he would probably want them to hold up their end of the bargain, which was supporting him when he kills his own father, and that he does glance at Lucian, and Farah mentions Lucian doesn't glance back at him, but as Eris glances at Lucian, there's a little bit of sadness, almost regret in his eye. And then Tamlin comes in, bandaged, but he still came to that first meeting, just like this one, with no one else with him. But Tamlin's eyes go immediately to Lucian and the clothes that he's wearing. And Lucian starts to say something, but Tamlin kind of cuts him off because Lucian is wearing Illyrian leathers. Farah wants to step in and mention that Lucian didn't have any other clothes, so that was the only option that they had for him. But Tamlin just shakes his head and moves on. And Lucian, in return, actually does stay with the Night Court at their side instead of following Tamlin in. Callias and Vivian show up along with that female who is indeed her sister. So we get confirmation that other female we were talking about in last chapter is Vivian's sister, but we don't get any other mention of who she is. We get Draken and Miriam and their host of people. Azriel nods because Nefel has also walked in. Farah mentions that she can tell because she has a smaller wing. Helion and the rest of the High Lords come, and then multiple minutes after that, Jury and Grayson show up, and Farah mentions that she put them on the opposite side of the room, not just Jurian from Miriam and Draken, but also Grayson from Elaine. Neither man responded, only strode proud and tall into that room full of fae. And then Vasa comes in, and we get to see Vasa just a little bit in this section, get to learn a little bit more of her personality, but she knows Nezda just based on the way Nezda walks into the room. She says to Farah, "I'm sorry for your father, he was a great man." Nezda walks in. Vasa recognizes her immediately based on what she's heard. She says, "I'm sorry for your loss to Nezda as well." And she goes on to say, "Your father was a better father to me than my own. I owe him much and will honor his memory for as long as I live," which I think is really interesting because I feel like he was, in that sentence, he may have been a better father to Vasa than he was to his actual daughters, from the sound of it, which sucks, but I mean, it is what it is. At least for the years when they were in poverty, he was not a good father for them. Vasa does ask Farah if Farah can break her curse. And Farah asks, "Is that the only reason why you came?" And Vasa says, "Well, partially. Lucian suggested that you and other High Lords here might have gifts who would be able to help." And Farah says, "Well, I don't know for sure. I don't know how to break those kinds of spells, but we can certainly try them." And she says, "Well, considering how much healing our armies will need to do, I won't be able to leave for some time. Perhaps that can be the loophole that I need to be able to stay here a little bit longer. And we can discuss that later, as well as the threat of my fellow queens. And she goes on to say they will try to intervene with any sort of peace that we discuss. Hybern sent them back before this battle, and I have no doubt they were smart enough to encourage that, not to waste their armies here. So that is a little bit of foreshadowing going into Nesda's book. Nesda demands, but will they waste their armies elsewhere? And Foss's response is, we will see, and you will think on ways to help me. And then she walks into the room after that command. And Farah is just a little stunned, and Nesda smirks and says, good luck with that. That Nesda does try to leave. She doesn't want to be a part of this. She is struggling with their father passing. We're going to see that a lot more when we get to Nesda's book. Farah does talk her into staying for the meeting because she is, one, their emissary to the human world. She should be there. But also because she is Farah's sister. She was a part of the battle. She was a part of killing the king. She should be a part of this discussion as well. Nesda does ask, do you think this will work, this meeting? And Farah says, I don't know, but I'm willing to try. So then she walks in, joins the night court, and then she is actually the one to kind of lead the meeting and says, my name is Farah Archeron, which she's actually owning her last name, which is not something that we saw her doing in the first and second book. But she says, my name is Farah Archeron. I was once human, and now I am Fae. I call both worlds my home, and I would like to discuss renegotiating the treaty. Which I think is really interesting, that she is the one who has this idea, wants to have this meeting, when in book 1, she had no idea what the treaty was about. Absolutely nothing did she know about the treaty. And now she is the one leading the discussions to get it changed. So, next chapter, we get the meeting itself. We don't get a ton of information in regards to the meeting, what is discussed, what their ideas for the future are. But a world divided was not a world that could thrive. The first meeting goes on 4 hours, many people short-tempered from exhaustion, but channels were made, stories were exchanged, tales were narrated on either sides of the wall. So Feyre tells her story, and I love this part because she mentions, I told it, all of it, to those strangers, to my friends, and I told it to Tam. Nearly everything I had seen in the Ouroboros, I let them see too. Which I think is interesting because right after she saw the Ouroboros, she mentioned not wanting to share that with anyone, including Reese. And now she has shared most of it with everybody in this. Miriam and Draken tell their own story. Their story, well, a glimmer of proof that humans and Fae could not only live together, work together, but actually thrive and be much more together. There are other stories that are told, some that are good, some that are similar to their own, some that did not go so well, crimes committed, relations that had gone poorly, hurts that could not be forgiven, but it was a start. There was going to be a lot more work to be done, but at least it was a start. And then the quarreling began because that's just what happens when you get so many people with different opinions. And that's when she can start to see that what Helion had said, that the temporary allegiance would fray and snap, but they do redraw the court lines. We don't know exactly what that looks like, and that it would take time and healing and trust. So everybody then decides to leave, that all of this stuff is going to be discussed at a later date, at a later time, later place. As Jurian leaves, Feyre asks where he's going to go. He mentions that Queen Vasa had offered him a place in her court, but he's not sure he wants to accept because it's kind of hard for her to have a court since she's still under a curse with another being. He does mention it's too bad the king was so spectacularly beheaded by your sister. I bet he could have found a way to break that curse of her. So it just makes me wonder if, like, later on we'll get them going to Hybern and maybe finding more of the king's spell books and possibly breaking the curse. I don't know. Maybe it's foreshadowing. Maybe it's not. We don't know. Everyone else leaves, and then the Night Court inner circle does winnow back to Valaris. And I love they mention it again because I feel like this is a reoccurring theme that we get when they winnow to Valaris. They can hear children laughing in the streets. It's one of the first things Feyre mentions hearing when she gets there for the first time. Lucian does the same thing, mentions it when he gets there for the first time, and they have come back, and they can still hear it. Despite everything that they just went through with this war, there are still children laughing in the street. Feyre mentions that she feels like, even though they've bathed and they're technically clean, that she feels like there's still a grime on them, like the blood hadn't entirely washed off. And she mentioned that her home, Valaris, seemed the same, but that they perhaps were not, because of all the things that they overcame with the war and that they went through. And Amren mutters, "I suppose I shall have to eat real food now." Cassian's response is a monumental sacrifice. She does turn to Nesda. Amren turns to Nesda then and kind of makes a joke about being surprised that Nesda didn't take the king's head back and have it stuffed and put on her wall. Says some would consider that joke to be in bad taste. And Amren's response is, "I saved your butts. I'm entitled to say what I want." And then she walks into the streets of Valaris. And Elaine says the new Amren is even crankier than the old one, which is funny coming from Elaine. And everybody bursts out and laughs. Okay, so they decide they're going to open lots of fancy bottles of liquor and wine to drink. Feyre does mention that she did actually give a note to Lucian to give to Tamlin because she did not have a chance to talk to Tamlin after the meeting and after telling everyone, including him, her story. And the note just said, "Thank you. I hope you find happiness too." And this is because she's realized that even as an immortal, there was not enough time in life to waste it on hate. And that perhaps one day Tamlin would be able to face his fears and that destructive rage rotting away inside him. Elaine and Feyre for a second discuss Nesda because at this point Nesda has left them, gone to her room. She wants to be alone. Elaine asks if we help her, and Feyre says yes, but not today, not tomorrow, not until she's ready. They're going to end up helping her even before she's ready, but that's going to be later. And I love that Feyre mentions Elaine nodded, smiling up at me, and it was tentative joy and life that shone in her eyes, a promise of the future gleaming and sweet. Because we talked about it towards the beginning of this book when Feyre first came back to the Night Court, that there was no longer that life in Elaine's eyes. It was darkness now, and so Elaine is starting to get that life. And Elaine declares that she's going to build a garden. After all of this, I think the world needs more garden. So we get a Rhysand chapter. Second to last chapter in the book is from Rhysand's point of view, which we only get a couple of these throughout the series. But he is actually in the kitchen because he's gone in to get them food. Everybody else is still in the sitting room or the living room, and he is just standing there looking outside, listening to the laughter of those that he loves. Cassian and Azriel come and they all kind of share a moment telling him it's real, this is all real. What do we do now? And Rhys's response is, well, until we have to do something in regards to the human queens or renegotiating the treaty and all that, until then, we enjoy every heartbeat of it. So then later that night, Rhys is on the roof because he's not quite brooding, but this is one of Rhysand's favorite spots. And Feyre comes up with him, and she is actually wearing one of the silky red things from that shop that they talked about in book 2. And she says, the shop ladies gave it to me for free as a thanks for saving them from hyper. Maybe I should do it more often if I'm going to get free lingerie. And Rhys says, hasn't anyone told you that you're disgustingly rich? And she's like, just because I have money doesn't mean I have to spend. And Rhys's response is, good. We need someone with a head for money because I'm bleeding out gold left and right thanks to our court of dreams and taking every advantage that they can. They talk about Amren just a little bit. Feyre asks if she is still their second. Rhys says if she still wants it, then she has it, even if she is only a high fae and doesn't have whatever power that was lurking. But Rhys says, I'm sure now that she's high fae, she'll discover that she has some hidden talent to terrorize us. And then they get a sentimental moment. Rhys tells her that he heard her when he was gone, when he was floating away after. I heard you even in death. It made me look back, made me stay a little longer. So very similar to how Feyre describes when she died in the end of book 1, feeling that tether and kind of holding on to it and coming back to it. Feyre does say, I never want to feel that way again. And his response is, well, now you know how I felt after Under the Mountain when you died. And then she tells him, never lie to me again, not about that. When it's time to go, I want us to go together. And Rhys says it's a bargain. And then she gets her original tattoo on her left arm, similar, well, exactly the same as the one she had in book 1 from him. The only difference now is that she actually has the band, the cuff from her bargain with Bryax. And Rhys has a matching version of the tattoo on his arm now. He mentions that Bryaxis has vanished and says, do you know what that means? And she says that I have to go hunt it down and put it back in the library. And he says, oh, you most certainly do. And this is one of my favorite lines in the books because she says, and will you come with me on this adventure and all the rest? And his response is, always. Well, then they go off to fly together over Valaris, and she is actually flying with him instead of just being carried by him. So this is the first time where they actually get to fly together, and they're flying over Valaris, and Rhys is getting to show her all of the things all of the reasons why he loves flying over Valaris. And she thinks that they would need to do a lot more, and it would be a hard journey in the days to come, but that they would leave the world a better place than they found it, which is exactly what the Suriel told her to do. And so she ends the book by saying all of this, being able to see each other again, be together is a gift. And that is the end of the book. That trilogy is done. Crazy. I didn't cry for the episode. I'm a little surprised.
I don't think I could make myself cry at this point. I've cried so much just reading these, and we're not even to the book that made me cry originally.
Okay, so the king is dead. Everybody is going to have to deal with the aftermath of what happened in the war. Healed. Everyone needs to heal from the war. We have Bryaxis, who is still on the loose that they have to go find. The Carver is dead. The Weaver is dead, presumably. What else? We still have a bargain with Eris that when he's ready to become High Lord, the Night Court will support him. We got a little bit more information on Amren and Moore, but they're still in Azrael, but we still have a lot of holes in their stories and backgrounds that we don't know about, like what the crap Moore's power is. We still don't know what that looks like because she didn't wield it in this battle. She fought alongside Vivi, but she didn't actually wield, from what we could tell, any powers. And it really frustrated me throughout the whole meeting in this last set of chapters that Feyre was like, oh, this person told their story and this person told their story. Well, I want to know what those stories are. So here's my question to finish out this episode. Which stories do we think we're actually going to get in a book later? Because I really think we're going to get a Vasa story that's going to tie in with their father a little bit. And I think we're going to get a Miriam and Draken story that is actually backtrack to their life, whether it'll include now or not, or if it'll just be like a little novella where we get their story when they actually went to save her people from the evil Fae Queen. But I would personally love to get that story. I don't really care about Moore getting the story. I mean, I want to hear more about her. I want to know what her power is. Is she actually a witch or not? But I feel like I would prefer
So do you mean like extras, or what you think is going to come out next?
I think at some point we will get Voss's story.
Yeah.
And I also think at some point we will get Miriam and Drake. I don't know to what extent, but I think we're going to get a little bit of both. Just because of the way things are worded in this. but I think that's also because I secretly want those stories.
Well, I wonder because initially I would have said I would want more story. But now with what you're saying, if there is that possibility, it makes you wonder, would there be more expanded in Draken's story as well as in Vasa's story if they do like before Vasa, like they go past and do some of her history, her family line before they get into her story. That could be a way
Right.
that it could bring her
To
story in with
see-
everyone else.
Yep, to see more characters. I think if they did Miriam and Draken, if Sarah wrote Miriam and Draken's story, it would just be this is what happened. This was their story. I don't know that there would be a whole lot now, unless there's more going on now. But with Vasa, I feel like it would be great to get the story leading up to when she is cursed, or at least parts of it, to understand her better and to understand, because I feel like all of what we've seen is on the continent of Prythia. We haven't really seen anything on the massive continent to their east, where the other Fey territory and the large human territories are. So I feel like it would be a great book to have Vasa's initial story of how she became cursed and how everything led up to the other human queens working with Hybern instead, and then led into after this part where whoever breaks her curse actually goes and breaks her curse. Like the book would span over potentially a couple of years. I think that would be.
Which could be. You never know. There is supposed to be a very large book. I do say I do want more on Elaine. I don't know if I, at this point, because I know there's tons of people out there shipping different relationships for her and all that. I don't know if I necessarily say that I want to say, oh, I want to see her with Azrael. Oh, I want to see Lucian. I don't know if I want that. I just want to see her expanded with what I've found that's endearing of her with this reread. Because I did not like her first pass through, and now she's really become someone. Okay, maybe you're not wishy-washy, maybe it's how you process, and there's something more that we haven't seen yet. So I really do want her expansion, and I think we're going to get that because you're not going to do the two sisters without the third.
Right?
Like that's
no.
Logic gives you that. But I think a Vasa story would actually be a good one. I hadn't thought much on that. I've always been focused on getting more and more story, but
I can't explain why. I just don't have a connection to more. Like, I want to know her background, her family's background, because they have more ancestry than Reese does that is tied to the Night Court. And when we get into Crescent City, I have some other thoughts on the Night Court that we'll talk about then. So, like, in that regard, I want to know more about her. But outside of that, it's not top on my list of stories that I'd like to see. Like, in all honesty, I want a redemption story for Eris. I want him to become High Lord of the Autumn Court and have his own mate and fall in love and just be like, have his redemption arc where we see Reese. I mean, yes, he has a mask on. He's just pretending to be that evil, which we're assuming Eris is very similar. I want to see that switch to becoming a good male. So I want that more than I'm interested in more story. Maybe they're tied together. I don't know for sure.
That's what I was thinking too. I don't know necessarily that I just want more, but I really want to hear more of Eris connected with more. I want to know that whole what happened, that's what I want to know.
So I think that could easily be what our next book is Eris's story. Which I think would be interesting because we do get a little bit of Eris throughout Nesta's book. So it would not be a difficult leap to jump into the next book being about or having him be a large part. Maybe all of the next books are going to be them taking out one human queen after another. And then each one of them ties into each one of our characters. Like, I do want to see Elaine more, but I don't want her with Azriel. I think Azriel deserves
Yeah.
somebody different. Better,
You can
not better
say
than Elaine, but different than Elaine. So I do think her and Lucian would be good together once they both heal. And Lucian is less of a fox, less conniving.
I think the next book's going to be more about breaking the curse on Vasa. I think that's where it's going to go. Because that'll be the next. I can't think of any other big thing that would need to happen, other than going there and defeating or,
Right. But I mean, like, before Nesda's book came out, that was my exact thought too, was the
Mhm.
next book has to
Yeah.
be that breaking the curse, whether it's Moore going and Moore ends up falling in love. Like, before Nesda's book came out, even before the novella came out, that's where my thoughts went. Maybe it's Moore who goes over to try to break Vasa's curse because she is truth. Maybe she can find something that she can. Maybe Helion goes with her to try and break the curse, because he's spell cleave. I mean, that could still happen, but prior to Nez's book, that was my next rational thought, was that has to be the next book. And then Nez's book came out, and not the evil queen that we get in that book. We get a different evil queen. So it makes you wonder, are we going to get what we think is logically the next thing? Or is it going to be something completely different?
So I'm curious for you now, because I know you read these as they were released. Do you think part of the fandom not liking Nesda, especially those that were originally part of it as they were being released, part of why they aren't a fan of book 5 has something to do with it not meeting expectations at the time of release?
Maybe. I think it's for everybody who loved Feyre, it's hard to love Nest, especially right after, because you fall so in love with Rhys and Feyre, and then having to switch. Like, not that I don't love Cassian, but having to switch, like, their relationship is so different. So different. And I mean, even Aelin and Rowan, their relationship is very similar to Rhys and Feyre. So to go to Nesda's book is just complete 180 from those other two series.
And then also having to read about Rhys and Feyre as a back burner, that
yes,
I struggle
that's hard.
with that too.
Really?
Because I was like, I want to know more about
just give
me
more.
Yes.
Just give me more about
Feyre.
Like
it was an afterthought.
See, I think it's more that we are so used to having Rhys and Feyre, and that having them as background characters was really hard. Because I can say, when you read Throne of Glass, at least for me, when you switch to not just having our three main characters, Dorian, Kale, and Aelin, and you switch to having Manon included in there, I hated Manon the first time I read Aerithar. Absolutely hated her. I came around to her throughout the rest of the books and through the rereads, but absolutely hated her because I wanted to know about Aelin and Rowan and what was happening with Dorian and Kale. Well, even Dorian and Kale, I wasn't as invested in as I was with Aelin. So I think it's just the adjustment when you switch to a new character because of how much you've put into the original.
See, and that's interesting. ACOWAR being my first full series of Sarah's I've read. I already knew, there's a novella and it's one of the other sisters, but I didn't look any further into it. So I had it, so it wasn't a letdown for me. So I got to treat it just truly as a new experience. So that's interesting because I didn't read Throne of Glass till time with you. So, and that was really cool. I think I told you I loved the back and forth. The only thing I hated with Tower of Dawn was the tandem read was just, I'm tired of switching. I want to keep going on this book versus that book. But I loved reading them at the same time because you still have all 5 or 6 perspectives.
All of your main characters. Yeah, see, I love Tower of Dawn. Very unpopular opinion, but I love Tower of Dawn because I am a Nezrin and Sartak fan all the way. I love them, so I will read Tower of Dawn any day. Not for Kim, but for Nesrin and Sartak, and a little bit of Iris. Because she reminds me so much of my cousin.
That's interesting.
So yeah, I don't know. I feel like we could. I think it's so. Talking about what we think is coming next, I also think, without knowing how else Sarah is going to interlock world, because we know that there is a crossover in Crescent City between ACOWAR and Crescent City. I'm not going to spoil anything else, but because of that, it leads to other things down the road between the, not necessarily, like they're not going to work together kind of thing, at least not at this point. I think Nezda's book had to set up for things to happen in Crescent. So it makes me wonder what else needs to be set up, because we're getting another Crescent City book at some point in the near future as well. So are we getting more ACOTAR books so that we can not only get more of our favorite ACOTAR characters, but also to set up other things in the Crescent City world? I don't, because that's a possibility. I guess.
And just like that, we've officially survived a court of wings and ruin. What a journey it's been. We've laughed, we've theorized, and we've been emotionally devastated more times than we'd like to admit. But we've loved every minute of it. Whether you've been with us since episode 1 or jumped in halfway and thought, yeah, these people seem just as unhinged as I am, thank you for spending this journey with us. We truly appreciate you joining us through every battle, every shocking twist, every unforgettable character moment, and every chapter of this incredible journey. If you've had as much fun as we have, don't forget to follow and subscribe, leave us a rating and review, and share this podcast with your favorite book bestie. While our journey through Prithian is over, for now, our adventure through the Maasverse is far from over. Next, we'll be stepping into the neon lights, magic mysteries, and absolute emotional chaos of Crescent City. Whether you're reading it for the first time or coming back armed with all of the knowledge you definitely didn't have the first time around, we hope you'll join us for every theory, every laugh, and every inevitable emotional breakdown. We'll see you in Lunathian. Until then, happy reading.
Woo!
Yay!
So much. Okay.